A racist officer fires beanbags at an elderly black man, unaware the man's son is a high-ranking general. The sun had barely begun its descent when Leonard Carter stepped out of his modest home, a small, weathered house in the heart of the city. At 73, his body was not as strong as it once had been, but his mind was sharp. He moved carefully, his cane tapping softly against the cracked sidewalk, a sound that had become a familiar rhythm in his life. The evening air carried a slight chill, the kind that settled into his joints and made them ache a little more than usual. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter around himself, and took steady steps toward the local convenience store. It was a short walk, one he had taken many times before. A quiet evening stroll, a simple errand, a routine so mundane that he never once thought to question his safety. He had lived through enough years, survived enough trials, to know that trouble rarely found those who weren't looking for it. But this night was different. The street was mostly empty, the occasional car rolling by, the faint hum of traffic from a few blocks away the only break in the silence. Streetlights flickered as dusk settled in, casting long shadows over the pavement. Leonard focused on his footing, mindful of the uneven cracks in the concrete. His knees weren't what they used to be, and a fall at his age could mean more than just a bruise. Still, he moved with a sense of quiet dignity, shoulders squared, back straight despite the stiffness in his spine. He did not notice the patrol car creeping down the street, its headlights off, rolling like a predator in the shadows. Inside, 2 officers sat in silence, watching him with the cold detachment of men who had long since learned to see suspicion where none existed. Officer Darren Cole gripped the wheel, his fingers tightening in small, rhythmic squeezes. His eyes never left Leonard, tracking his slow movements like a hunter studying prey. Next to him, Officer Ryan Miller sat with his coffee, taking lazy sips, his posture relaxed but attentive. Miller was younger, newer to the force, still finding his footing. He had seen Cole act like this before, had heard the stories, but had never been the one sitting beside him when things began to spiral. Cole's voice broke the silence inside the vehicle, low and filled with quiet disdain. He muttered something under his breath, his lip curling slightly as he spoke. His grip on the wheel tightened just a little more, his fingers twitching as if itching for an excuse to act. Miller followed his gaze, frowning slightly as he spotted Leonard making his slow way down the street. He didn't see anything out of place. An elderly man, moving carefully with the aid of a cane, his pace unhurried. His clothes were neat, his posture dignified, his face marked with the deep lines of a long life. Nothing about him spoke of trouble. Miller leaned back in his seat, shifting slightly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. Cole's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his expression hard. His voice was laced with something bitter, something ugly, when he finally spoke again. The words carried a weight that Miller could feel pressing into the space between them. Miller hesitated before responding. His instinct told him this wasn't right, but instinct had little place in situations like this. He had learned quickly that questioning a superior, especially one like Cole, was a mistake. He exhaled quietly and forced a chuckle, a weak attempt to diffuse the moment. His words lacked conviction, but he said them anyway. Cole didn't acknowledge the response. His focus remained fixed on Leonard, his jaw tightening. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Leonard, unaware of the eyes tracking his every movement, continued forward. He was only a few steps past the store when the sudden sound of tires screeching against asphalt shattered the quiet. The patrol car came to an abrupt halt beside him, red and blue lights flashing in violent bursts that painted the street in unnatural colors. The brightness washed over Leonard's face, deepening the lines carved by age and experience. His heart clenched in his chest, a heavy sinking feeling settling in his stomach. He had lived long enough to know what was coming. His steps faltered, his grip tightening around the handle of his cane. The memories of past encounters, the weight of history pressing down on his bones, all came rushing back in an instant. He had seen too many moments like this unfold, had read about them in the paper, had heard about them in whispered conversations. The knowledge sat heavy in his mind, a bitter truth he had never been able to escape. The car door swung open with force, the sound cutting through the still evening air. Officer Cole stepped out, his posture rigid, his presence commanding. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon, a calculated gesture designed to establish control before a single word was spoken. The moment stretched, the air thick with unspoken tension. Leonard remained still, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but firm, carrying the weight of a man who had lived too long to be easily intimidated. He started to explain himself, his words measured, his tone respectful. But before he could finish, Miller's voice cut through the space between them, sharp and impatient. Leonard drew a slow breath, steadying himself. He had never been the type to challenge authority, never been the type to invite trouble, but he had also never been the type to cower. His hands moved carefully, deliberately, raising slightly in a gesture of compliance. He kept his voice even, refusing to let the tremor of anger or fear seep into his words. He tried again, his words simple, direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Cole's voice snapped like a whip, the command sharp and unwavering. His stance shifted, his muscles coiled, ready. The radio crackled at his side as he reached for it, speaking into it with practiced ease. His words were clipped, professional, carrying the weight of an accusation that had yet to be made. He reported a suspicious individual matching a description, though no description had been given. There was no need for one. The color of Leonard's skin had already decided that for him. The weight of the accusation settled like a stone in Leonard's chest. He had seen this play out before, had watched it unfold in headlines and grainy videos. The steps were always the same: the call over the radio, the shift in posture, the tightening of hands over weapons, the manufactured justification. His heart pounded, his breath coming a little quicker, though he willed himself to stay calm. He had no weapons, no threats, nothing but a bag for his groceries, and the cane that now felt like a liability. The moment stretched into something unbearable, something electric with the unspoken violence that hung just beneath the surface. Leonard knew, in that instant, that it did not matter what he said next. His words would not save him. The outcome had already been decided, and then, without warning, Cole moved. Leonard barely had time to process before it happened. The moment stretched, suspended in cruel anticipation, but the reality struck with a force that shattered any lingering hope for reason. Cole moved first, his hand snapping to his radio in a practiced motion, his voice slicing through the still air with a cold efficiency that only came from repetition. His words carried weight, an irreversible condemnation woven into the lie he spoke. He barked into the receiver, his tone laced with the false urgency of a man who had already decided how the story would end. He framed the narrative before it had even unfolded, branding Leonard as a threat before he had a chance to utter another word in his own defense. Miller stood beside him, the weight of the accusation settling heavily between them. His lips parted slightly, hesitation flickering across his face, but the moment passed before he could act on it. Cole was already moving, his hand dropping from the radio to his belt, bypassing his firearm in favor of something designed not for immediate death, but for humiliation, for degradation, for suffering. The decision was intentional. Death would be too final, too quick. This was about power. This was about proving a point. The weapon discharged before Leonard could react, the beanbag round tearing through the air with a sickening force. It struck his ribs with a brutal thud, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs in a strangled gasp. The pain blossomed instantly, a sharp explosion beneath his skin, reverberating through his already frail frame. His body recoiled from the blow, his feet faltering beneath him as his balance wavered. The weight of the pain drove him backward, his vision blurring at the edges as his body struggled to process the sudden agony. Another shot followed before he had a chance to recover. The second round slammed into his leg, a vicious, unrelenting force that sent searing pain shooting up through his bones. His knees buckled under the assault, the strength in his limbs failing as gravity took hold. His cane slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly to the pavement as his body crumpled beneath the weight of the attack. The world tilted, his surroundings distorting as his head spun from the shock. The pain was overwhelming, a brutal reminder of his mortality, but more than that, it was the humiliation that settled deepest within him. The helplessness, the powerlessness, the knowledge that his suffering was not an accident but a deliberate act, fueled by malice rather than necessity. He gasped for air, his chest heaving as he struggled to form words, to plead for reason, for mercy, for anything that might halt the assault. His voice, usually so steady, so sure, cracked beneath the strain. The plea barely left his lips before another shot came. This one found his shoulder, the force sending a fresh wave of agony through his body. His breath hitched, his fingers twitching against the cold pavement as his body curled inward, instinctively trying to shield itself from further harm. His pulse pounded in his ears, the rhythmic throb of pain overtaking every other sensation. Miller stood frozen, his stance shifting uneasily, his eyes darting between Leonard's crumpling form and his partner's unrelenting brutality. The hesitation was evident in the way his fingers flexed at his side, in the way his weight shifted from one foot to the other, uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his conscience. He had seen violence before, had witnessed force being used, but this was something different. This was not a struggle, not a necessity, not an action justified by circumstance. This was cruelty. The radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the tension, but Cole barely acknowledged it. He was focused, his eyes locked on Leonard's trembling form with a glint of satisfaction. His stance remained firm, his grip on his weapon steady, as if waiting for an excuse to fire again. The rush of power coursed through him, the intoxicating high of unchecked authority. He had been here before, had stood over broken bodies, had felt the weight of his actions press down on those beneath him, and he had never once regretted it. Leonard groaned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, each inhale a fresh reminder of the damage done. The cold pavement pressed against his cheek, his body trembling from the pain that radiated from every impact point. His vision swam, darkness threatening to pull him under, but he fought against it. He forced his eyes to stay open, to remain present, to bear witness to his own suffering. He would not give them the satisfaction of slipping away. The street remained empty, the world indifferent. No one came running. No voices called out in protest. The city moved on, oblivious to the brutality unfolding on its streets. The officers loomed over him, their shadows stretching across the pavement like specters, distorted beneath the flickering glow of the streetlights. The night swallowed his pain, offered no solace, no reprieve. Cole smirked, his expression devoid of remorse. The amusement in his eyes was unmistakable, the satisfaction of dominance carved into the cruel curve of his lips. He tilted his head slightly, surveying the damage, taking in the sight of Leonard's broken body with a sense of accomplishment. The power he held in that moment was palpable, unchallenged, absolute. Miller shifted uneasily beside him, his jaw tightening. The discomfort was evident now, creeping into his posture, into the way he swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he tried to find his voice. He hesitated, uncertainty warring with the ingrained obedience that had been drilled into him since the moment he had donned the uniform. The conflict played out in the subtle twitch of his fingers, in the way his eyes flickered between Leonard and Cole, in the way his breath came just a little too fast. Cole did not bother to look at him. His focus remained on the man before him, on the evidence of his power made manifest in bruises and broken breath. He did not need Miller's approval, nor did he care for his discomfort. This was the way things were done. This was the lesson that needed to be taught. He lifted his foot, nudging the fallen cane further away with deliberate cruelty, watching as it rolled slightly before coming to a stop just out of reach. Leonard remained still, his body weighed down by the pain, by the exhaustion, by the years of injustice that had led him to this moment. He fought to keep his eyes open, fought to keep breathing, fought to hold on to the sliver of dignity they had not yet stolen from him. He was not afraid of death. He had lived through worse, but this was different. This was not a war fought on foreign soil, not a battle against an enemy he could see. This was a slow, grinding erosion, a lifetime of being seen as less, of being treated as something unworthy of the respect afforded to others. And then, somewhere, a phone was dialing. The call reached a man miles away, a man who had spent his life defending a country that had never truly defended him. General Marcus Carter sat in his study, reviewing classified reports, his mind preoccupied with the calculated precision required for military strategy. His days were spent analyzing threats, coordinating deployments, and ensuring that the soldiers under his command were prepared for any conflict that might arise. The weight of responsibility was something he carried well, the years of service having molded him into a man who did not waver under pressure. He had been trained to maintain control, to assess situations with logic rather than emotion, to respond with measured force. He had mastered the art of restraint. Then his phone vibrated. A sharp, urgent buzz against the mahogany desk, breaking through the calculated stillness of his study. His hand moved instinctively, reaching for the device, expecting another routine briefing, another security update, another call that required his expertise in matters of war. But as his eyes fell on the screen, the world around him shifted. The text message was brief, almost clinical in its delivery, but the impact was immediate. His father, beaten, shot at, by police. For a moment, there was only silence. His breath did not hitch, his hands did not shake, but something inside him turned to ice. His mind, trained to process high-stakes situations with unwavering focus, struggled to make sense of the words before him. He had seen battlefields drenched in blood, had sent men into conflicts knowing some would not return, had witnessed firsthand the brutal consequences of war. Yet nothing had ever ignited the kind of fury that now roared to life within him. His father, the man who had raised him with quiet strength, the man who had taught him the meaning of discipline and honor, had been left broken on a city street like discarded trash. Then the photos came through. The images, grainy and dark, captured the aftermath of the assault. His father, lying motionless on the pavement, his body curled in on itself, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. The sight was a blow worse than any battlefield casualty, worse than any intelligence report detailing lost lives. This was not a war zone. This was not an enemy stronghold. This was home, and the people who were meant to serve and protect had done this. Marcus did not hesitate. His body moved before his mind could catch up, years of training dictating his response. His fingers tapped out commands on his phone, his voice sharp and precise as he issued orders through secured lines. The chain of command that usually required layers of clearance was bypassed with the authority his rank afforded him. He called in favors without preamble, his tone making it clear that delays would not be tolerated. The police department responsible would not be allowed to bury this under bureaucratic procedure, would not be permitted to twist the narrative to fit their version of events. He was done watching men in uniform abuse the power they wielded so carelessly. His network activated within minutes. Military contacts, federal agents, and political allies were looped in, the machinery of influence shifting under the weight of his command. Doors that were usually closed were forced open, resistance crumbling under the sheer force of his status. He was not a man who made idle threats. He was not a man who accepted injustice. The officers involved would learn, in the harshest way possible, that they had made a mistake that could not be undone. His mind was cold, calculating, stripping away the personal pain in favor of efficiency. He gathered every piece of information available, compiling names, badge numbers, shift schedules. The officers who had left his father bleeding on the ground would not be granted anonymity. Their superiors would not be granted plausible deniability. He would expose every failure, every cover-up, every injustice embedded within that department. There would be no escape. With each call he made, the storm grew. The response was no longer local. It was no longer confined to a single precinct or a single city. The reach of his influence stretched beyond municipal boundaries, beyond state lines. The police department was about to feel the full weight of a system they had never imagined would turn against them. They had underestimated the man they had brutalized, had mistaken his frail body for weakness. They had failed to realize that his strength did not end with him. It had been passed down, sharpened, forged into something unbreakable. The wheels were in motion, and there would be no stopping them. The police department had chosen the wrong man's father to target. Cole and Miller remained at the scene, their postures shifting between impatience and lingering adrenaline, the night air still thick with the remnants of what had transpired. Leonard lay unmoving, his breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls as pain radiated through every inch of his body. The pavement beneath him was cold, unforgiving, but he focused on that sensation, using it to ground himself, to remain conscious, to bear witness. The taste of blood lingered in his mouth, coppery and bitter, but he refused to close his eyes. He would not let them take even that from him. The distant growl of approaching engines cut through the silence. The sound was different from the standard police response, heavier, more deliberate. The officers barely had time to process before the first unmarked SUVs pulled up, their dark silhouettes looming under the flickering streetlights. The doors swung open with precision, revealing figures in suits, their movements efficient, their presence radiating an authority neither patrolman had ever encountered before. These were not local cops, not the usual bureaucratic enforcers who would sweep an incident under the rug with a few well-placed excuses. This was something else, something bigger. Behind them, stepping out last with measured steps, General Marcus Carter emerged. His stance was rigid, controlled, his uniform pristine, but his eyes burned with an anger that could melt steel. The air seemed to tighten around him, the weight of his presence suffocating in its intensity. He did not rush. He did not need to. Every movement, every breath, every second that passed was an unspoken declaration of power. He had come not as a grieving son, but as an executioner of justice. Cole straightened instinctively, his training urging him to assert control of the situation, but for the first time in his career, the authority did not belong to him. The balance of power had shifted, and though he had yet to fully comprehend it, the creeping realization was beginning to settle beneath his skin. One of the agents, a man with an expression carved from stone, stepped forward. His badge gleamed under the harsh light, a silent testament to the reach of the force now bearing down on them. His voice was calm, unshaken, absolute. He stated their names with precision, each syllable a nail sealing their fate. Darren Cole, Ryan Miller. He informed them that they were being taken into federal custody, that they were under investigation for excessive force, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. Miller paled, the color draining from his face as the words sank in. His eyes darted to Cole, searching for reassurance, for some indication that this was a mistake, that they could talk their way out of this. There was none. His breath hitched, panic creeping into his limbs. Cole scoffed, his bravado slipping into forced defiance. His body tensed, his jaw clenched, the instinct to resist warring with the slow, dawning realization that there was no escape. He tried to assert control, to insist that they had only been doing their job, that this was procedure, that they had done nothing wrong. The words felt hollow even as they left him. Marcus stepped forward then, closing the distance between them with the kind of authority that was not given but earned through years of commanding men on battlefields. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. He repeated Cole's words back to him, dissecting them, stripping them down to their raw, ugly truth, their job, their duty. He forced the weight of those words back onto Cole, forcing him to reckon with them. They were not officers of the law, they were hunters, and his father had been their prey. Cole opened his mouth, some final protest forming, but before he could utter another word, his arms were yanked behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into his wrists, the sharp mechanical click echoing in the heavy silence. The sensation was foreign, jarring, a reversal of the power he had so easily wielded against others. His breath hitched, his body stiffening with a rage that had nowhere to go. Miller stumbled backward, his movements clumsy, uncoordinated. His hands twitched at his sides, his mouth opening and closing in a series of half-formed protests. He had not pulled the trigger. He had not been the one to fire. But he had stood there. He had watched. He had done nothing. The realization struck him like a physical blow, but it came too late. Another agent stepped in, closing the distance with a swift, practiced motion. His hands were wrenched behind him, the cuffs locking into place. His breath shuddered as his reality collapsed around him. Leonard remained where he was, his body unwilling to move, but his mind stayed sharp, absorbing every detail, every shift in power, every consequence unfolding before him. He felt his son kneel beside him, the familiar presence cutting through the haze of pain. Marcus did not speak immediately, did not rush to fill the silence with empty reassurances. He simply existed in that moment, the fury in his eyes dimming into something else, something raw, something vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, the rage tempered by something deeper. He was there. He had come. and they would never touch his father again. The officers were dragged toward the waiting SUVs, their struggles meaningless, their protests swallowed by the night. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside, their fates now in the hands of forces far beyond their control. The street, once a scene of unchecked brutality, now bore witness to the first stirrings of justice. Leonard exhaled slowly, the pain still coursing through his body, his breath still uneven, but something else settled within him. It was not safety. Safety was a lie, a fragile illusion that could be shattered in an instant. He had lived long enough to know that the world did not grant men like him the luxury of true peace, but justice? Maybe, just maybe.